And joining me now are Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists Carol Leonnig and Aaron Davis. Their new book, Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department, is now out, and everybody is talking about this book. It is. I just took a peek at Amazon, Carol and Aaron. It's doing great, so congratulations. It looks like it's another big hit, but it's an important one too. And I'll just say it. This is how I do things now. I just say it like it is. It's as far as I think it is. And one of the things I've said repeatedly on my show is that one of the reasons we are where we are right now is because, and I know there's a lot more to the book than what I'm about to say, is that Merrick Garland was just a bit too timid in going after the people at the top of the scheme to overturn the 2020 election. I know that's a big part of your book. And I do want to talk about the classified documents case and Jack Smith and so on and so forth. But if we could start there, that would be great. I guess, first of all, Carol and Aaron, thank you so much for doing this. I'm huge fans of both of you.
Well, Jim, first of all, Aaron and I are huge fans of yours. We're delighted to talk with you because, first off, we think that you do say it how it is, and you also ask good questions, gosh darn it. So here we go.
Here we go. And
here
hopefully
we
you can
go.
answer the questions. But, I mean, what do you make of that premise that I just laid out? Feel free to attack it with a meat axe or put it in a blender, whatever you want.
What Aaron and I found was that Merrick Garland has incredible respect across a very broad political spectrum. Republican judges and Supreme Court justices respect him. Democrats and progressives respect him. But as the Attorney General, what he wanted to do after Trump's first presidency was restore faith and public trust in the Justice Department. And he harkened back to an almost antiquated and naive playbook, which is post-Watergate, where he grew up in the Justice Department. He was very much involved in writing the rules for separating and creating independence between the White House and the Department of Justice, and kind of these strict ethic guidelines. And so he has said publicly, and we heard more of this from inside the building, that it's not enough to be above politics. You have to appear and have people believe that you're above politics. And to do that, he steered the ship very far away from looking directly at Donald Trump. And so many people who worked for him and admired him hoped that the Justice Department would do, kind of walk and chew gum. They would do two investigations, look at the riot, and then also look at Trump campaign allies, and developing evidence in December of 2020 that there seemed to be a plot for him to try to overturn the election.
Yeah. And, and a lot of this boils down to, and again, correct me, just feel free to correct me at any stage in this conversation, but there was a focus on, or a priority was given that they go after the rioters, the people. It was sort of like a bottom-up approach to the investigation. And there's one part in your book where you guys write, unless investigators turned up clues from rioters' phones or financial records that pointed them back toward the president's campaign, the authors write, the decision effectively walled off Trump and his allies from becoming subjects of an FBI probe. It was the January 6th committee, I guess you both write, that ended up uncovering so much in the case that the Justice Department wanted what the committee uncovered. That's a fascinating part in all of this. And it was, I think, what a lot of people just suspected was going on, that this bottom-up approach took too long and it just didn't get to the heart of who was at the top of this scheme, it seemed to me, to overturn the election results.
Yeah, just to pile on there a little bit with what Carol said. The people we talked to who were close to the Attorney General at that time, he really felt by the conversations he had with people that he had time. He came in after January 6th and thought, that the country was in a different place, that nobody could respect in what just happened at the Capitol, and it was too, egregious. And so they weren't thinking about this on a timeline. And so, wanted to take the time, wanted to build this thing up brick by brick is a phrase that you hear often in that, senior leadership, where there was just so much evidence they had on camera that they were going to get there that way. The other thing that I think is problematic, though, is that the public thought there was an investigation going on. And, you go back to the day after January 6th, where then acting U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Michael Sherwin, comes out and there was a press conference. It's a remote press conference in the middle of COVID, but he's asked, how far will you go in this investigation? He says, we'll go as far as we need to. And he's asked specifically about Donald Trump. Will you go to Donald Trump? And he'll say, he says, we will take this to, even people who weren't there at the Capitol will be, held accountable. And the next day there's headlines in the New York Times and Washington Post and everywhere. Donald Trump will be the subject of investigation, the Department of Justice says. But we actually found that a full 15 months went by before they really put the spotlight on what had happened regarding Trump and people around him and his campaign and the fake electors and all of that. And that meant in that gap, you're right, the House Select Committee and the investigators, they were the first people laying down the tracks and doing these interviews. And that was a remarkable upside down situation where, people working for, at the behest of a congressional committee are the first ones doing interviews that are going to be, eventually important in a criminal case.
Mm. Yeah. And so, Carol, I guess it was that the Attorney General was sort of blindsided by just how much evidence was out there, that or was it that he was going back to what you were saying earlier, that he was such an institutionalist that he was trying to protect the institution from looking overly politicized? And so he sort of slow walked. I mean, maybe not intentionally, but it's sort of what happened. This idea that they needed to investigate this thing from top to bottom. And it sort of bit them in the end. They waited too long.
We'll never know, Jim, what could have been, but we know that losing 15 months was enormous. Jack Smith, who becomes the special counsel, ends up having to sprint when he's finally appointed. And it's actually, we'll get to that, I'm sure. But back to Garland, we have some moments that we were sort of stunned by inside the Department of Justice. Here's one example. Garland tells people that his aides and deputies that we have to, be above reproach. We can't look political in any way, shape, or form. Well, in the investigations, which eventually involves the classified documents case and the election interference case in the fall of 2022, when I have to start over because I have to tell you something different.
Yeah.
You asked the question blindsided. In June of 2022, when the House Select Committee is putting on its pretty sexy televised hearings, right? Yeah. Here's our findings. They have Cassidy Hutchinson testify in a blockbuster hearing. Now, we find that her testimony ends up not being critical to the criminal case, but it's pretty blockbuster stuff that she shares about what it was like the morning of January 6th and the day before, how much Trump wanted to drive up to the Capitol himself, how much he wanted to walk with the protesters, how much he was warned there were weapons in his protesters' hands and he wanted to let them come into the rally anyway and don't screen them, all these things. Well, we learned that Garland is watching those televised hearings on that day, and he turns to a coterie of aides and says, "Did we know about her?" And
wow.
One aide turns to him and says, "No, sir, we didn't."
Wow.
That afternoon, Thomas Windham, the one prosecutor who initially was appointed in late 2021 to look at potential ties to the Trump campaign and election interference and fake electors, that afternoon when Garland is shocked and blindsided is when Tom Windham, for the first time, reaches out to Mark Meadows to ask for the records that the House Select Committee has had for 8 months. Ask for his texts and his emails that were, fairly big news.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron, that just sounds, so they didn't know about Cassidy Hutchinson. I just want to, I'm a bit dumbfounded. I think I just passed out. It's pretty wild. I mean, to me, it sounds a little bit like, I'm just going to say it. Prosecutorial malpractice. It sounds a little bit like, investigative malpractice, that they weren't overturning every rock that they should have been. And they were being a little too careful, a little too cautious. I am going to get to the classified documents and Jack Smith and everything else, but just to button that part up. Sure. That's just wild to me.
It wasn't just Cassidy Hutchinson, though. We found in our reporting, and there's these scenes in the book where the inside this senior staff of the Attorney General's office, they start clearing a part of the Attorney General's afternoon schedule on the days of the House Select Committee hearings, and they have what they call a hot wash, where they go back over everything that's been said publicly that day, because it's all really at that point new to them as well, because they have not interviewed so many of these people that the House Select Committee had interviewed. I mean, they knew Cassidy Hutchinson existed. She was on a file somewhere, people they could interview, but they had not interviewed her to that point. They didn't know the allegations that she would raise if she was interviewed. And so they were learning it in real time as the public.
Yeah. And a lot of us in the reporting world who covered all this stuff at that time have spoken with Cassidy Hutchinson. And that, to me, I mean, it seems to me she would have just been fine talking to them. It might not have happened right away or whatever, but my goodness. The second part of the debacle, if I may call it that, you don't have to call it that, is the classified documents case. And I think from what I understand from what you've reported is that, flash forward to Jack Smith, he's the special counsel, he's handling these two cases on two separate tracks. And there's this issue of getting assigned the case of Judge Aileen Cannon. And I guess one attorney calls another attorney on the team to tell him that the fate of the judicial wheel and who was selected for the case was Judge Aileen Mercedes Cannon. And one of the attorneys says, "You're not going to believe it." Brat said, "We got Cannon. It was the worst news. We're screwed," Olson said. Tell us a little bit about the classified documents case, what happened there. That was a bit of a car crash too, and getting Judge Aileen Cannon. And it sounds as though Jack Smith was maybe under the impression, well, the documents case is so airtight. We've got so much great evidence here. We're going to be just fine. It doesn't matter what judge we get or where the court is or whatever. And that wasn't the case.
Right, totally. To remind, Judge Cannon had, for a procedural reason, shown herself in handling the actual search warrant of the subpoena and search for Mar-a-Lago in August 2022. She was the judge who kind of caught the case of the fight over the search and the recovery of the documents. And she showed herself to be so pro-Trump as to ignore decades of court precedents. She was basically spanked by the appellate court above her, which said, "You can't do what you just did, and everyone knows you can't do what you just did," which was to try to block criminal investigators from actually looking at the classified records that they own and had recovered in triplicate from Donald Trump's club in Palm Beach. So what happens with Jack Smith is he is making a decision in the spring of 2023, just months into being appointed special counsel. Where should I indict this classified documents case? The evidence of Trump withholding and obstructing justice, obstructing the case to try to conceal these records is overwhelming. It's on surveillance tape. It's on texts. It's on the documents they actually carted away in FBI vans. So it's, in their view, a slam dunk case. But the issue is, where is their strongest legal firmament for bringing it? Jack decides, after a legal analysis by his team, that it's Florida. Well, the problem is, prosecutors can bring a case wherever they have venue. And many people, including a prosecutor named David Raskin, who was on the team, assumed they would go to D.C. for lots of reasons. One, experienced judges who know how to handle classified cases. Two, Aileen Cannon, in his view, was as he said to his team, an existential threat to the case. When Jack presents to the Department of Justice and Merrick Garland's team that he's going to bring the case in Florida, they all kind of put their finger to their chin and think about the legal issues of why that's a stronger way to go. But David Newman, a national security prosecutor, says to Jack Smith, if you get Cannon, this case is dead. That's your biggest risk. And that is exactly what happened. The case collapsed.
Wow. And what about Jack Smith now? I mean, and, the way Trump has gone after him, and he's been somewhat public lately. I think he did an interview with Andrew Weissman and so on. And he's been rather feisty in responding to what has been taking place. I guess you guys write a little bit in the book about how there was a sort of a cult of Jack Smith, or he was a bit of an insular figure in terms of how he was running that team, and that may have harmed perhaps the process of what he was going through and the team was going through in terms of putting together these cases. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, are there some folks who worked under Jack Smith who are saying, or maybe observers in the Justice Department who are saying, that didn't work out so well, despite his sterling reputation?
There's a lot in the book about, inside this insular world of Jack Smith and his special counsel office. It's really something that the American public has not heard anything about so far. And some of it's really fascinating. They really had essentially a special counsel's office that was already up and running inside the U.S. Attorney's office on, the election interference case. And they had, like a full staff of people working in the national security on the classified documents case. All those attorneys, they were trying, Jack gets appointed and, Jack's in a hospital basically. And as it happens in the Netherlands, the day that Garland calls him and asks him if he'll become the special counsel. And so he says he basically takes the entire staff that's already working. So these aren't necessarily all Jack's people. It's not like a Mueller investigation where he went and handpicked every person who was going to be on his team. He was, started running as fast as he could. And he does those first months of the investigation. He runs them from the first floor of his flat in Amsterdam, where he's like a metal hospital bed has been put where the kitchen table was because his leg had been broken. And so people are going over there briefing him. He's making decisions. And he arrives back in DC the day after Christmas, and basically most of the staff shows up that day, and they start going from then. But Jack, the good and bad of Jack in everybody's mind was that he was decisive and he would make a decision. And Garland, it's part of the reason he picked him in the first place. When he ran the public integrity section earlier in his career in the DOJ, he had come in and evaluated all the cases that were out there after the disaster of the Ted Stevens prosecution, and just axed a bunch of ongoing investigations. And so Garland felt that this guy's going to come in and he's not going to necessarily try to get a prosecution. He's just going to decide, do we have it or don't we have it, and go forward one way or the other. Now, he did make those decisions in a small group. He was not going to involve everybody. And the people who really, care about him and know him from the years say that was partly because he's like, someday, and we are now in the someday I'm going to be the one held accountable for these decisions. It's not going to be the team and everybody else. And so he was not going to make decisions by committee. It was ultimately going to come back to him.
Yeah. And I guess I wonder how I didn't get all the way through your book. I'm going to, but I want, one of the other theories that I've had about why Donald Trump was able to win the presidency, and I know you both talked about this somewhat, he was able to, and there's the book again, is that he was able to use these cases against him as a political weapon, and he was able to just ride his way through the Republican primaries and so on, by saying, woe is me, look at the way they're coming after me. They're not coming after me, they're coming after you, and I'm just standing in the way. He used to say things like that. But, he played the system like a fiddle, was just my overarching recollection of the entire debacle of when he was out of office. He just played it like did you get to what is kind of wrong with our judicial system that allowed, these two pretty damning cases against him to just go up in smoke, and that he was just able to puncture them at every turn?
The classified documents case was the one that was the election interference case. Jim, this.
Yeah.
It was complicated, and there had never been anything like it. Oh, I don't know why another president hadn't tried to use angry, militant, organized supporters to stop a certification of a free and fair election. Right? That had never happened before in our country's history. Yeah. And so bringing that criminal case was complex. But the classified documents case was in the words of many of the people we've interviewed, a slam dunk. And we have a scene in the book where, right after the raid, the FBI drives off with boxes and boxes in vans around 4:00 on that particular August 8th of 2022. They find that there are documents in there that there are people that literally who are national security mishandling records chiefs and deputies, that their job is to recover sensitive documents. They have the highest clearances you can have, but some of them are not able to look at those documents because that's how securely they must be kept. They're part of special access programs where only the president or a cabinet member can authorize someone to look at those documents. So we're talking about serious national security risks. If any of the pages that were spilling out of the shower room at Donald Trump's club landed in the hand of a Chinese spy who happened to sneak into Mar-a-Lago for a party. Really big stuff. That night, there's a teleconference with the Assistant Attorney General, Matt Olson, and his team. Hey guys, what do we got? What do we do now? They're reviewing how serious some of this material may be, the volume of records that they've obtained. And Olson says to this encyclopedic expert on his team, Julie Edelstein, what do we do now? And she says, if it was anybody else, we'd arrest him tomorrow. Anybody else, right? Trump was given special deference because he was a former president. And Aaron and I don't take a position on whether or not you should show deference to a former president, but there was room there in that time in the fall to potentially bring that case. And Merrick Garland actually demanded that his team freeze the investigation for 2 months before the midterm elections. Some people were really shocked by that inside the office. There's something called the 60-day rule you might be familiar with.
Yep.
Yeah, and you're not supposed to, in the Department of Justice, bring a case that might affect an election or affect a candidate's election. The thing that was making people inside the Department of Justice recoil at Garland's order was Donald Trump's not on the ballot in the midterms. He's not a defined candidate, but Garland took the conservative approach. And you asked the right question, Jim, which is there something wrong with our Justice Department that let this go? And again, we're not in the business of taking a position, but what we can tell you from the voices of the people inside is that all this deference and all of these careful choices and timorous choices, perhaps, of Merrick Garland's to not have any perception of politics made this case that was a slam dunk never happen.
Wow.
There's just one thing I would add to that, which is, in so many ways, Donald Trump benefited from all of the careful cautiousness that, to really, indict an American citizen for a crime that are built into the system. And one of those that they really had to investigate, and this kind of slowed down that seemingly very black and white classified documents case, were all the people around Trump who were also creating a lot of confusion about, had he declassified these documents? Had he done that? Including the person who's now the FBI director, who was out there very, very publicly claiming that the president declassified all of these. He ends up and getting interviewed by investigators at one point in time, and behind closed doors pulls back on some of that. We report in the book. And so,
Kash Patel was saying very publicly, oh, he declassified all this stuff. And then when he was brought in front of the prosecutors, the attorneys, they said,
I don't know about all those documents. I know about some. So
there's an expression for that, but I won't say it here.
So
it was highly misleading.
Yeah, talking out of his ass is what I was going to say. But anyway, go.
The FBI took an incredible amount of time to run every one of those statements down, to interview all those people who are saying those things publicly, so that they could know, is there any truth to this? Because if we actually indict the former president on this, we can't have something come back later and have been wrong. So there was a if you're going for the king, they really did feel like they had to. And so much of it was also that they were so beat down from the first round with Trump and the Russia investigation and how he personally attacked agents and prosecutors. And there was a real reluctance. There was a big fight inside between prosecutors and agents about whether even to conduct that raid at Mar-a-Lago. That, we should just take his word for it. He's the former president. That was, a quote by one of the FBI folks at the time.
And I know you're in book rollout mode, so I don't want to take any more of your time, but I'll just ask very finally, just and feel free to wrap it up as succinctly as you can, but contrast all of that caution, all of that respect for the system, all of the reverence that Merrick Garland and Jack Smith showed for the Department of Justice and the checks and balances and our system of government, the Constitution, and so on. Contrast that with what has been taking place since January. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to chuckle, but if you don't laugh, you'll cry. Donald Trump now going after his political enemies to the point where he has convinced federal prosecutors, and I still think this is shocking to me, and I don't get shocked easily, that you have people like James Comey being hauled into federal court on, and I'll say it, my characterization, ridiculous charges. I mean, what has happened to our justice system, Carol?
It's not wrong, Jim, to say it's ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
Pat Fitzgerald, Jim Comey's lawyer, at the arraignment said, I can't tell what my client is accused of. And the reason he can't tell is because the evidence and the supporting documentation is not in front of anyone. But you're so right to focus on contrasting the caution, the carefulness, the institutionalism of a Merrick Garland and what Donald Trump is doing. The former head of the Public Integrity Section, this elite unit in the Justice Department that was created to chase down corrupt officials that are on the take, right? And to prosecute them and to ferret that out after the Watergate era. The head of that office, John Keller, has been extremely careful in not talking to the press in his real job. But now he said to us, and sounding an alarm, when you bring cases without factual evidence, when you charge people and you don't have the documentation to show it, and it's your political enemy, this is the hallmark of a dictatorship. And he has every right to say that, because that is what dictatorships look like. And it is so shocking. We spend a lot of time in the book explaining how the Department of Justice got weakened and kind of rope-a-doped and pushed around and fearful and in a defensive crouch. But what Donald Trump is doing now is making all Americans less safe and putting into rubble the credibility of this institution. When Democrats take over, do you think people are going to believe that the criminal charges that are brought against a senator who happens to be a Republican are warranted? Or are they going to think, yeah, this is just the new guys in town are bringing criminal charges against somebody they don't like?
Yeah. No, the damage is, Aaron, the damage is hard to calculate at this point. We won't know for years, perhaps.
Yeah, it's true. This has become apparent, I think, maybe more so to the public as the Comey indictment and Letitia James indictment have come down and made big headlines. But to the people inside the Department of Justice, those first days were, quite traumatic. We're inside the rooms as they are searching for any of the thousands of agents who were involved with January 6th to go ahead and completely excise them from the Department of Justice, from the FBI. The entire upper class of executive assistant directors inside, just lopping them off. And these are folks with decades and decades of experience and have led some of the most sophisticated, counter-espionage and intelligence and national security cases, and all of our foreign interactions with other countries and their law enforcement for decades, and they're all gone. There is a huge brain drain inside the department. The shudder, I think, went through the building, though, on the day that, if you remember, Trump goes in and has a press conference at the Department of Justice, and they actually covered up some of the statues of like Lady Justice and things behind him, and put this blue curtain and set up like a stage in the middle of the Justice Department for him. And they pipe in his like old campaign music for this thing. And nobody can really believe that this, is like basically a campaign really happening inside the Department of Justice. And Pam Bondi comes out and says, we're so lucky to work at the pleasure of the president. And some people's mouths drop open hearing that throughout the building and other, auxiliary buildings at DOJ. That's never anything that anybody thought they were hired to do at the Department of Justice. George Bush and others have gone in that building and dedicated it, saying, your mission here is to the rule of law, not to me as the president. And that was echoed when Garland, the first day he was in office, and Biden said, don't answer to me, answer to the American people. That's
Mm.
just so different now where we are.
So different in so many ways. But I'm so grateful to both of you for laying all of this out in your book. It's going to be just so important for people to read from years from now. It's called Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. Carol Leonnig, Aaron Davis, thank you both so much for your time. I personally could go on all day, and I could take up another half hour of your time, but I won't do that because that's not nice. You're on a book tour. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
It was
All
great,
right.
Jim. Thanks again.
Thanks again. Best of luck.